joined us. Hi, Luke. You are muted at the moment.
I am muted. I'm no longer muted.
So
how are you?
I think we've been chatting. Everything seems to be working all right on our end.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I've been running around because people are buying tickets very last minute.
Oh no, you're fine.
You're in very good hands with Roberto.
I've done all the background work with them, so.
Well, when are we kicking off? In a minute.
I suppose so.
Yep. So yeah, actually, what order do we want to do? I've prepared 350 words or so, the brief background.
So since I'm the moderator, I think it goes, Luke introduces us, I start the panel, and then I'll basically be like, introduce yourselves, let's go, Bulgaria,
Okay.
Latvia, Georgia, basically.
Okay.
I'll go last because I prepared absolutely nothing, and I go based off memory half the time. So let's go. I know some of the stuff, but yep.
It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Just don't tell that to people who bought tickets to this.
Yeah. I thought you were going to be in a field, Kristaps. Very disappointed to see you in a room.
No. It's because well, I made a mistake because I didn't count on this being Eastern American time. See, it's almost 6 p.m. for me here, and this event goes up until early morning. And I had thought I would be speaking actually in the morning when I was in the countryside, but I couldn't just stay there because I have a lot of things to do tomorrow morning, and I wouldn't make it in time. Yeah,
fair enough.
Should we get started then?
Yeah. I'll click start webinar. Good luck, guys.
Sure.
Hi, everybody. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming you to our first panel, where we have Eric Halsey from the History of Bulgaria, Kristaps Andjreson, probably badly pronounced, from the Eastern Border Podcast, and Roberto Toro from the History of Georgia podcast. Take it away, guys.
Gamma Job, everyone. As Luke just said, I'm Roberto from the History of Saqartvelo Georgia, and we're going to be presenting Occupied, or a history of how we learned to love Russia. So we're going to talk a bit about the occupation of different areas. So Eric, of course, Bulgaria. Kristaps basically covers the whole eastern border, and I cover Georgia. So
just so you know, to give us a better representation, I have a Poland t-shirt on. So
yeah, and so we're going to start off with Bulgaria being the closest one to the eastern border area. So Eric, take it away.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Yeah, as I said, I'm Eric Halsey, the host of the Bulgarian History Podcast, joining you from Sofia, Bulgaria here. And so let's get into it. Now, interesting enough, modern Bulgaria actually had two Russian occupations. So I'll briefly talk about both of them, and then we can get to questions and stuff later. But the first one was kind of an occupation by choice. After Bulgaria gained kind of partial independence from the Ottomans after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. So, Russians came in, conquered the country from the Ottomans, and the Bulgarians were pretty glad to see them at that point. But once that formal Russian occupation ended, I think a couple months is fairly short. Formally, the great powers wanted Russians out of there because they wanted to limit their kind of influence. Russia then spent the next couple decades trying to control the Bulgarian government through coups, organized revolts, assassination attempts, diplomatic isolation, just everything under the sun. So that bit, not technically a kind of a more occupation, but more an attempted occupation for a good 15 years or so. And this caused the young nation irreparable harm, a tremendous amount of harm, just as it was trying to recover from 5 centuries of Ottoman rule. So there's that kind of very brief, very odd occupation there in the 19th century. But the more famous one, of course, we all know is, the Soviet one. So the second occupation, the Russian or Soviet one, came after the Second World War. Now, interestingly here, Bulgaria's role in the Second World War is a bit odd. They joined the Axis powers, yes, but literally at the barrel of a gun. It was sign the tripartite pact or we invade you. That's your choice. It's join or die kind of. And the country eventually said, okay, fine. But Bulgaria then refused to send its soldiers and kind of tried to stay out of the Second World War for the whole time, just kept giving excuses. And so what was weird there was that Bulgaria actually never went to war with the Soviet Union. They had a functioning Soviet embassy for the whole war, despite technically being an Axis power. And so this occupation came when the Soviet army was rolling into Romania. And at this point, Bulgaria is trying to get out of the war. They're like, we've never really participated much. We never wanted this. Could we please just get out? And the Allies said, no, unconditional surrender only. And at this moment, the Soviets decide, I think it's time to just declare war and invade Bulgaria so that we can kind of exert our control. So that is what happened. Basically, the Soviets helped orchestrate a coup in Bulgaria, declared war, invaded, and the Bulgarian government very quickly switched sides and began fighting the Germans. And so this kind of triggered the beginning of the Soviet period in Bulgarian history. And during this, occupation, if you want to think of it that way, it was also a bit different than a lot of the other Eastern powers. You could say that Bulgaria was kind of the most pliant of all the kind of Eastern Bloc countries. I always say, like, when the Soviet Union, when Moscow said jump, Sofia said, how high? Like, we're in it, we're there all the way, do whatever you say. And so as a result, Soviet influence in Bulgaria was a bit lighter than some of the other Eastern Bloc countries, just because there was no need to be super heavy-handed, because Sofia and Bulgaria was just so incredibly loyal to the Soviet Union. Though, that said, there was internal dissent, and as a result, there were brutal sort of concentration-like camps, famously in Belene on the Danube and a little island and things. But the flip side of that was that Bulgaria had never had, its dictators during the Soviet period were a bit more chill compared to someone like Ceausescu. So yeah, the kind of Soviet influence, quote unquote, occupation, the communist period in Bulgaria, I'd say, was comparatively relaxed. And as a result, when it ended, Bulgaria was the only Eastern Bloc country to elect the communists in its first democratic elections in the 90s. So kind of two strange Russian-Soviet occupations in quotes, and that's kind of how Bulgaria did both of those. So that's my little kind of brief summary there, and I will hand it off to you, Kristaps.
Hi, everyone. Hello from the Eastern Border Podcast. Well, I just like to mention the thing about Bulgaria. Over here in the Soviet Union, you guys were known as informally as the 16th Republic. Anyways, it was kind of like, if someone would be sent to kind of a trip, then if he would be sent to Bulgaria, that would barely be treated as foreign anyways. It was super close ties. But over here in my region, well, here's the thing. I kind of looked up and about how we would be occupied by Russians and all throughout the history, and I figured out that I kind of have to do a hard cut before the Great Northern War. Since we have Livonia, and at some points it's a vassal state to one power or another and everything. But like the final point of this over here in the Baltics at that point is Peter the Great, who decides to cut a window to the west and beats the Swedes in the Great Northern War. And then in 1721, well, everything just turns up and we become a part of the Russian Empire. That goes on for a while. At one point, when Napoleon invades, everyone here is like, oh, yes, we might no longer be serfs. And then it turns out, nope, he likes Alexander. And this whole thing went on up until the greatest revolution ever, the one in November the 7th. But then everything breaks up in the Civil War. And this is another complicated issue because during this whole mess of the Civil War, they obviously made another pocket Soviet government that invaded our territory once again. Lots of fighting happening. But if you have to put like long stops, then it's Russian Empire for hundreds of years. Then that collapses and we become independent through massive struggles. Then we have the first time Stalin decided to plop in our country in 1940. Then he goes away for a bit, comes back in 1945. And then we got our independence fully restored in 1990. We were a completely integrated part of the Russian Empire with some autonomy because of all the local German nobles who, were previously crusaders, then they stayed. And then they left in 1939 because Baltic Germans kind of went away back to Germany. But and then 70 years of the Soviet stuff. Oh, we had it pretty rough. But I do have to say that not just Russians, we were basically occupied by everyone in Europe who wanted to access this region. We've been pretty much awful stomped over by everyone. But Russia, yeah, we had a lot of experience with this. Now, the interesting part about all the Baltics and the Russia is that we always were looked in the Soviet Union as kind of a local foreign country, because we had all these Art Nouveau buildings, and since even in the Russian Empire times we were ruled by German nobles, local nobles German, someone from the center sent as governor Russian. We were still in the Soviet era looked as the weird foreign part of the USSR, which is a bit weird. But well, since we have been into weird situations with Russia for all the time, basically, since we have written records of our existence, yeah, we're pretty worried. And with all these close ties over here, since, well, every time something happens when Russia gets uppity, yeah, if you look at the whole history of our region, you kind of understand that it will probably end up with us being, a place where they walk through to get to where they want to go. So it's kind of interesting. But yeah, integral part of the Soviet Union, which is a bizarre thing, since I still managed to be born in the USSR, and I still have my green birth certificate. And it's getting quite weirder at this point as we go on, since these days the kids are all very, very scared that when I tell them that I was actually born in the Soviet Union. But we have a lot of experience here, and we have a lot in common with Poles, and well, we can find common language with the Finns too. So I kind of represent the northeastern corner of everything. So Roberto, tell us about Georgia then.
Okay, about Georgia. So Georgia has had not one, not two, but three sets of Russian occupations throughout their history. So the first one comes around the 1780s to 1801, which, because Georgia at that time was broken up into small different kingdoms, and they were facing the Ottomans, the Persians, and basically they went to Russia saying, hey, we're both Orthodox. We want you to help us against these Islamic conquerors. Can you help us protect ourselves? And Russia was like, well, yes, of course, we'd love to help you. Our brothers in Christ, we're going to be there. And then Georgia was like, oh, thank God, someone's helping us. And then, the Russians start coming in, they start helping, and then slowly but surely, Russia starts annexing the different kingdoms. And the Georgians are like, wait a second, what are you doing? And they just keep annexing, and then Georgians can't do anything because their military is basically shot up to basically nothing, because they've been constantly fighting against all these Islamic conquerors. And there's even the Georgians even have their own 300 situation, the 300 Arabians, which I will cover some other time, not today. But essentially their military is destroyed, and the Russians just come in and just start saying, you're part of us. And then in 1801, with George the 11th, Paul the First of Russia, or Paul the Only of Russia, he basically comes in and says, yep, you're part of us now. And then, a few months later, he's assassinated by his son, supposedly. And then at that point, Georgia's just part of the Russian Empire. So, they're annexed. You have the hero of our time written by Lermontov, who just kind of goes oh yeah, these Georgians are kind of barbaric without understanding everything. But it's kind of Tbilisi is such a nice place. You have Pushkin writing about the area. So a lot of authors go to the Caucasus and they absolutely love it, but it's also, but they're not Russian. And then, skip over back to the November Revolution, or even just the revolution in general, because Georgia breaks away and becomes the First Republic of Georgia. And at that point, they are essentially going, okay, we are our own country, and they run things by themselves from 1918 to 1921. And then from that section, they are essentially fighting against the Russians constantly, because the Soviet Union is coming down into the mountains, and the Georgians have this very particular thing they enjoy doing, which is if there's an enemy, they run into the mountains to just kind of hide away and fight, because it's kind of hard to fight people in the mountains when you can't find them. And then, but at the end of the day, they're still a small nation. They have the full might of the Soviet military coming through, and they're conquered once again. And then, the big people who come from Georgia in the Soviet Union, Stalin and Beria, basically repressed the place to oblivion. So like because they're Georgians, are like, yeah, we know how they're going to be. They're going to fight back, and then repression. And then kind of things roll along. Soviet Union breaks apart. Georgia becomes its own independent republic. It just celebrated its last 30 years about a month ago. And at that point, in 2008, we have essentially the Russians coming back in under Medvedev, who essentially take what the Saqartvelo region of Georgia, or what people call today South Ossetia, and they annex that. And then there's also Abkhazia, which is under Russian control, but that's also like from the 90s civil war. So essentially 20% of Georgia is still occupied by Russia. So, and that is a thing that the Georgians will tell you on a constant basis, that 20% of our country is occupied, and our government is not doing anything because they're basically run by a group of people who get all their money from Russia, and they have like a shadow oligarch who basically gets all of his money from Russia. And that is the issue they're facing today with basically getting into the EU, because they got denied because the EU is like, we need to say, put sanctions on your one oligarch, because it is only one guy who runs the place. So that is what they're facing right now. And yeah, that is a brief summary of Georgian occupation.
Oh boy. Well, what you started to say at one point is kind of like, yes, Medvedev, I recognize that person, but yeah, like I mentioned this before, this is why we're kind of making jokes about all this all the time, because hey, it constantly gets a bit worse. One interesting thing about all this, specifically Soviet stuff, is that if you think about it, we're currently in totally different areas, but the thing that me and Georgia, we were in the same country, and I am in Riga up there in the north, and Georgia is way down. But that's the interesting part, which is interesting about how Soviet Union collapsed, since technically every member state, and Bulgaria by extension, because they were not a member state, but Moscow still ruled over everything. The order in the USSR was that each separate republic, kind of like state, had their own version of state government, basically. So Latvia would have their Latvian Communist Party, which would then answer to Moscow, and we had our own parliament and everything. Same with Georgia, same with everyone else. Everyone obviously listened to Moscow, and they had to do what Moscow told them. But on paper, at least, they were nominally independent states that had joined the Soviet Union. However, interesting fact is how this control worked, since there was one interesting glaring omission from this whole system, and that was Russia itself. Basically, Russia was the largest separate state, one of the whole 15 states that made up the Soviet Union, and it didn't have its own state government. The federal whole government of the Soviet Union also served as Russia's thing. So the whole attitude was a bit different for them.
Interesting. Well, I think if we don't have any questions here, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the legacy of these occupations. And, one thing, occasionally when friends and folks will come over here, I'll give them tours around Sofia and point out things. And one theme I always like to point out is that kind of the relationship between Bulgaria and Russia has been, for its entire modern history, sort of the fundamental schism of Bulgarian politics. Literally, if you look at the first few decades of nominal independence after 1878, more or less one of the main political questions that divided politics was, are you a Russophile or are you a Russophobe? And that almost extends until now. I mean, even today with the Ukraine war, Bulgaria's relationship with Russia remains sort of a fundamental question of Bulgarian politics. And it's just wild to me that, these countries we don't even share a border with them. But the historical legacy of those occupations and the competing narratives about them, was Russia our big brother who came and helped Bulgaria and yada, yada, or were they the imperial power who came and, abused Bulgaria? And which side of that debate you kind of rest on tells you an enormous amount about someone's politics and still kind of defines a lot about the country, which I think is quite probably a little bit different than Georgia or Latvia, where imagine it's a little less divided, a little more clear cut where most people stand, although the oligarchs obviously have their role to play in Georgia.
Yeah, and like essentially because the people of Georgia are, and even the president of Georgia is very much, we do not support Russia, but then Georgian Dream, the political party, is basically going, oh, well, they're okay. We can't, even with the whole Ukraine crisis, which is the essentially the big thing right now. The main political party, Georgian Dream, is essentially not allowing the president to outwardly support Georgia, and then they found some random excuse to like sue her because she was like, "Oh yeah, I support Ukraine," and they're like, "You can't say that. Like, we don't agree with that." And like the best part is she's an independent, and she's affiliated with them because they're the biggest party and they win everything. But
I think the biggest kind of common thread that we can see from all of us here, and I will allow myself to speak for all the other Eastern Bloc countries that are not represented here in this panel, is the fact that one big consequence of all these occupations is the fact that over here in these regions, yeah, you can use Russian as a lingua franca. Sorry, it's all this cultural stuff as well. Everyone knows that there is this one movie that you watch for the New Year's celebrations, Slyokim Param. Always, we share a lot in common in our cuisine and everything, and also we're, in general, at least over here, another thing that's culturally changed us and drove us together is all this cultural influence, because yeah, we're in a lot of ways we're way more introverted over here than people in the West are, specifically in the United States. And I studied this a bit and understood that, hey, it's a recent invention because, when you have a massive secret police organization which is taking denunciations from people, then then you kind of don't want to talk to random strangers on the street. That's kind of interesting, since a lot of people here have, very bad feelings and extremely well-deserved terrible memories about this whole process, because one thing the Russians love to do is try to kind of minimize the local cultures as much as possible. A lot of people here call it Russification, which happened because all the street names had to also be in Russian, and your local traditions, local language, and tries to be pushed out all the time. But in a way, it has created a situation where even if I went to Ukraine and I speak Russian and they speak Russian, they're being invaded by Russia. So when I spoke in Russian and in Ukraine, I always had to start with, "Hello, I'm a journalist from Latvia, and I will now be speaking in Russian." This is always important. We all use it. It's just something that, as much as a lot of people would want to completely cut ties off, it's still going to be there, and we're going to have to deal with it somehow. Which is why, if we're making all these different podcasts about specific areas of our Eastern Bloc thing. But yeah, if you have probably noticed, Soviet Union and Russia has had a lot of impact in this area.
Yeah, and like anecdotal evidence is when I was studying abroad in Russia, like I went to different countries surrounding the area, and of course went to Georgia, and I could speak English with the younger people because they learned English, but with the older people, I didn't speak Georgian. I still don't speak Georgian, and essentially I would have to use Russian with them. And you can see they're like kind of like, "Oh my gosh, he's speaking Russian to us." But so as you mentioned, it's a lingua franca, and like a lot of people like when you have to like learn the language of your oppressor, it's like, well, we use it because everyone else can speak it, but we rather speak in our own language. So, and then I do want to say, so everyone knows, if you haven't read the chat, you can ask us questions, please. Like we're a panel here. Feel free to ask us a question. Raise your hand. Write in the chat if you want. If you want to actually speak to us, we can give you speaking precedence.
Oh boy, you're being
got a question for you.
Oh God, I got the first question. I would be interested in hearing Roberto's thoughts about Saqartvelo and his political activity since he left the Georgian presidency in 2013. Oh boy, that is okay. So Saqartvelo is a weird case because he's technically wanted for treason in Georgia. Yeah, that is a very big can of worms. So he's wanted for treason in Georgia because he, without getting to like too much detail, because I actually don't like modern politics too much. It stresses me out, but essentially Saqartvelo went to Ukraine to work as a governor in Ukraine, and he's basically wanted for like corruption and different things. And it's very weird because he left, and then we have they brought in a new president, and then they were ousted, and then they have Zorabishvili there now, and she's beloved by the people. But Saqartvelo is like, he's only doing well like in the eyes of the Georgian people now because he's not Garibashvili, who's a prime minister. So like everyone hates the prime minister right now because he basically cracked down on like the pride rallies. He's basically taking a very pro-Russian stance, especially with what's going on in Ukraine. And then Saakashvili is basically, oh yeah, I went to Georgia, I went to Ukraine, became a governor, while I was wanted for corruption. Now I came back and I'm making a big political deal because of I got arrested and I'm going on hunger strike. So he's basically trying to get back in the good graces of the Georgian people, but it's not a it's more a political move than anything, because I don't think he's actually being like true to himself about these things.
Yeah, at this point, questions about current events are oh boy. This is why we have all of our podcasts, because every time we want to tackle a political thing, it goes on for episodes.
Okay, there's a question from Elizabeth. Is there a history of soft resistance to occupation? How was this manifested? Open to anybody here.
Let's give Eric that one.
Yeah. So, in the first kind of occupation, there wasn't as much soft resistance to Russia as much as hard resistance by Bulgarian politicians who, didn't want to become a Russian puppet and didn't want to just do everything Moscow said. This is the 19th century kind of occupation and like period of influence. And, at that time, it was more, Russia's trying to assassinate and lead coups and is even like landing troops on Bulgaria's Black Sea coast to try to orchestrate a peasant uprising, just doing everything they can. But later on, during the Soviet period, yeah, some resistance, but not a lot. I mean, there's the famous case of like Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian journalist who went to the UK, murdered via umbrella by Bulgarian Secret Service, probably with some help from the KGB and things like that, but not a whole lot. But if we have time later, I'll note I would love to talk about the kind of historical legacy and how Russian occupation is viewed today, but we can see what you guys think on the soft question.
Okay, I see a question from me. Kristaps, what threat do you think Russia is to the Baltic states? Oh boy, well, it's been a constant weird threat to us all the time since we've been kind of preparing for another possibility of getting in trouble since the 90s, since the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is why we joined NATO and everything. We've always had this in the background. Like the very fact of relations with Russia have always been a major political issue for everyone elected here, and your relations with the Russian people who live in our countries as well. So it's always a bit complex, but we weren't surprised at all, because I've written an article about this. Basically, we always expected that this, something like what happened now with Ukraine, could happen, except we didn't know where and how, and we tried to minimize our odds. But yeah, it's always been a big threat, and it depends on their leadership, of course. It was better in Yeltsin's era. Yeah, when Yeltsin was the president, yeah, it seemed really bad in the 90s, but if you think about it now, well, the old guy could just be back on the screen and maybe drinking some more vodkas, but yeah, he's passed away. It all turned out really weird, and as a lot of ex-prime ministers and people who got us into NATO and EU and did a lot of reforms and funded our defense budget and everything and did all the diplomacy, like to say these days, yeah, we hate the fact that we were kind of right about preparing for all this situation. So which is why we're so helping Ukraine as much as we can, because yeah, it's kind of a mutual feeling here and in Poland at least as well, that hey, we're just doing all the helping stuff because it was just a roll of the dice and anyone could be there because something has gone terribly wrong with Putin. That's about it. And the threat right now, well, currently it's mostly Lithuania that has to be worried since of the Suwalki corridor and all the Kaliningrad stuff, and it's very much blown up. But the thing is, it all depends on how prepared are we. And right now, I think actually the threat to the Baltic states is less than ever since all the attention is towards Russia right now anyways. And see, if we would be invaded and quickly taken over, say 3 years ago randomly and like 2 months, then probably nothing would happen and NATO wouldn't rally to our defense. Right now, I think if Russia would even try to do something, yeah, this is the point where NATO countries would kind of join us. So in a way, we're sad and everything, but another way we're weirdly enough a bit more secure than we were before the war. But for this, we kind of feel like we have to do our own part. I hope this answers your question.
Okay, so speaking of Kaliningrad, because that is a place that was occupied by the Russians and became completely Russianized. So because it was, Königsberg for a while. So how would you see like places that have like been under Russian occupation for so long that they're just completely Russianized?
There's a different thing here. See, in Kaliningrad, they forcibly moved out all the German population. And technically, they were given it only for 50 years, kind of like an occupied territory. The one thing that isn't known is that when Germany unified, then they were actually, well, technically on paper asked, hey, guys, do you want Kaliningrad back? And at that point, the German chancellor denied this because there were no Germans living there. And he would get a bunch of other issues, political issues within Germany, if he would accept it. That would cost him a lot of money. And also, they already had issues integrating East Germany with West Germany. They had a lot of issues there. That would have caused a lot more problems. So right now, it's going to stay there.
I've seen some analysis also speculating that in addition to the reasons you listed, that Germany also didn't want to accept it because the UK and France in particular were very concerned that a newly unified Germany would start wanting to expand and retake old territories. And so Germany had to be very careful, like, absolutely not. We're not interested in doing that. And there's some speculation that Russia only offered Kaliningrad as a way to sow division within Europe as Germany was unifying. So that's just some analysis I've read I thought was fairly interesting.
Yeah, and that's kind of the weird part, because over here and like everywhere around, it seems kind of conspiratorial, but Russia, at least a lot of people in Russia and current Russian government, have a lot of sort of imperial memories remaining in them, and they do mess in our elections. And Bulgaria, Georgia, wherever you see them, there are definitely people who are clearly under Russian influence, and all this stuff is kind of being dealt with. And they at least they mess with my work, because I managed to actually get into trouble because of the show with the Russian government. So felt this on my own skin.
Yeah, badge of honor.
I'm banned from Russia after all. Oh, nice. It is weird though. Oh wait, we have a question.
Yeah, from Jimmy. Potentially provocative question. What can the UK learn from the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Oh. See, I think that I think the fact that if you look at the Soviet Union and even modern day Russia to an extent, you could see that it's kind of like the British Empire in a way, because Moscow always treated other regions as colonies. And and let me tell you, these guys will probably support me on this one. When you get a centralized metropolis where everything is just based and where all the money is and where all the businesses are registered, basically the situation in Soviet Union and right now to a large extent in Russia is like, imagine if in your country every business ever would be registered in Moscow and paid taxes there, and then the guys running Moscow would decide how much money to give to your region, and they just wouldn't give any if they didn't like what's happening in your region. Nice. So I think that you can actually, I think that UK has actually learned, and I think that it's the other way around, since Soviet Union collapsed, but the people who are now in power, they want to restore the big empire. I kind of don't think that people in UK want to restore their whole colonial stuff. That's my opinion.
Okay, so another question I had. Sorry if you want to say anything, Eric.
I mean, go ahead.
No, you first.
Well, I want to check this thing I thought was fairly interesting, kind of on brand. Just to briefly mention, like the interesting question of like the legacy of Soviet occupation and the legacy of Russia's relationship with Bulgaria. Because what I found fascinating doing my podcast and like deep diving into that history is that so many Bulgarians see Russia as like a friendly country, as like the older brother, like, oh, they've always had our back. They, they liberated us from the Ottomans and they've always had our best interests at heart. And actually diving into the history and finding like that is really not true. And that, to my opinion, Russia has treated Bulgaria horribly. I mean, again, the orchestrated coups, the attempted invasions, I mean, just doing everything it can to make sure Bulgaria never has an independent policy and only ever does what Russia wants it to do, and treating Bulgaria in a very disrespectful way. Like, yeah, it's just the little provincials and like their opinion's not worth a baggage. Well, I don't know if I can curse here, I suppose.
It must be interesting with the Orthodox Church as well. Because I really wonder, this is one thing that I haven't checked on really. I know Bulgaria has their own patriarch, their autocephalous. But
yeah,
that's a big issue there. Since how was it in the Soviet since in the Soviet Union they still kind of they had freedom of religion on paper, even though it was sort of an atheist state. You could get into a lot of trouble. But right now, well, the kind of in the Orthodox world, of which Bulgaria is a part of, it's kind of the whole issues with Ukraine, autocephaly, and the relationships with patriarch in Moscow. They're kind of strained. So I'd like to ask you, what's the feel over there, and how many people like view the Bulgarian patriarchate, and how dependent it is on the Moscow, and what are the relationships there?
So I haven't heard much about that. I mean, even though I follow Bulgarian politics very closely and live here and things, like the Bulgarian church, you almost never hear their opinion on anything. They're not a major political force. People here, all Bulgarians will say that they're Bulgarian Orthodox, but no one actually goes to church. Almost no one. So, for here, it's a matter of identity and not like an active thing that you do. And I think my opinion, a lot of others, is that like in Russia, a lot of senior members of the Orthodox clergy here are corrupt. They've got fancy watches and drive nice cars and things. A lot of them are former state security informants and things like that. And so, I haven't heard the Bulgarian Orthodox Church really give any statements, say, about the war in Ukraine or anything. But on the other hand, the independence of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church is something that goes back way before there was an independent Russian Orthodox Church. And, they gained that independence in the 19th century, not from or any relationship to Russia, but from Greece, right? During the Ottoman Empire, the Orthodox Church was run by Greeks, and it was a major, major element of Bulgaria's kind of national awakening to break away from the Greek-dominated Orthodox Church and achieve that independent autocephalous orthodoxy. And so I think, it's not really viewed too often in relationship to the Moscow church.
And because I'm Orthodox, so the question of Orthodoxy, basically in Georgia, they do not like the Russian Orthodox Church at all, because it's something about 1807 basically causing the Georgians to join the Russian Church. So basically the Georgians lost their autocephalous church and they had to go into the Russian practices, and they just recently got back their own during the Republic era, they got back their church, but then that was quickly stomped down on by the Soviet Union. So essentially the Georgian church is not like the Russian church at all, just because of that. And then because the Russian church is very pro-Russian government and they're not separate, that is also not helping their case. So we have 4 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Feel free to raise your hand.
I can comment on one thing though. One thing that's totally in common in all this sphere is the fact that you can go to the kind of the outskirts of every city on the Eastern Bloc, and you know that you're there by the buildings every time. Khrushchevkas or something extremely similar to Khrushchevkas exists over there, which is why it's funny when I visited Berlin, and one of my listeners whom I met there asked me, "Oh, can you tell me where East Berlin starts?" And I'm like, "Yeah, over there with that row," because that's kind of an interesting thing. Another big kind of eventful stuff. But if anyone has any questions, then please do ask. I'm not sure if they can.
No.
Really.
Just make a brief comment, but I think it's interesting in Sofia, besides the kind of Khrushchevka inspired panel blocks, I call them panelki here, the other bit of kind of a Russian legacy in terms of architecture is the central square that I live 5 minutes from, which you would think you were in Moscow. It's absolute Stalinist era. That central part of the city was bombed in the Second World War and really destroyed, and they rebuilt this kind of complex called Largo, and it is 100% classic Stalinist style architecture that you would see in Moscow, kind of very traditional and very kind of formalistic, a little neoclassical and things. And so I always find that very interesting, that this little bit of central Sofia, but just that bit, is so like photos I've seen of Moscow.
Yeah, luckily Tbilisi, behind me here, didn't manage to get very destroyed during the World War II. Basically, a lot of the damage was probably done fighting against the Russians. So essentially, most of their construction stays very Georgian, and so but they still have the Stalinist architecture and everything. 2 questions. Are there any cultural things, arat, games, songs that are specific to each other of your countries and not done in Russia?
Oh yes, I literally came from one. We have our biggest national celebration here in Latvia that still exists. It's a Baltic celebration, so it's basically super important. Latvia and Lithuania were the most important part, but Sweden and Finland and Estonia also have a tinier versions of it. It's not as important for them. It's our Midsummer Fest. It's called Jāņi or Līgo, which is a pagan festival that's been in existence for our people since the 9th century, which is a festival dedicated to beer, cheese, and fertility. Yes, let's call it fertility. So that works. That's one thing. And the language is totally different, of course, but a lot of kind of weird issues that we had here. And we have also another thing is that we in Latvia, as because of the German nobles, we're 100% in the beer belt. Meanwhile, I 100% know that in Georgia, beer is not the drink of choice, and neither it is in Bulgaria.
Yeah, like with Georgia, I can say that I'm just going to go quickly because we have 1 minute, less than a minute. We have like the Christmas traditions are very, very different because Jordans like to like shave little branches down to like make them look like beards so they can represent St. Nicholas's beard. So that way, you're giving gifts to the children and they have like different traditions and food and everything. So Georgia is very much held on to its culture. And Eric.
I'll just say, Bulgaria has been a state in Europe for more than 13 centuries and was a state in other areas before that. So there's a lot of old like pagan traditions, all kinds of stuff from nothing to do with Russia. But that's all I have time for.
Well, excellent. That was fascinating, gentlemen. Thank you very, very much. I hope everybody enjoyed. I don't know if that's the right word, but I was interested by everything that was said today. Thank you very much. That was excellent.
Hope I'll see some of you in my panel or in my talk in 5 minutes. So
or in mine. Oh, share one.
Or in mine.
Or in my panel.
Well, see, it wouldn't be a panel on Eastern Europe if we wouldn't be miserable in some way or form,
Yeah. And competing.
Living up to the stereotypes. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.